Welcome to the first session in the book of Titus. And over the next 7 sessions, we're going to unpack this short but very important letter, bit by bit, all the way from the beginning to the end. In all of the sessions, we're going to use 2 main tools that will help us to unpack Titus. The tools I'm talking about are 2 questions that we can ask of the whole book and of each passage in the book. And the first question we're going to ask is why? Why was this written? Titus, of course, is a letter that someone wrote, and so we want to ask the question, what was the original purpose of the letter? What was the original purpose of a passage in the letter? What was going on that caused the letter to be written, and what did the writer want to see happen as a result of what was written? And so finding the purpose, why was this written? That is our first tool. The second question we want to ask is how. How was this written? And by that I mean how has the letter been organized, or the passage? What is the structure of the letter? What is the structure of the passage? How does it all fit together and flow? How does one part relate to the better part, to another part? And the more we understand the structure of the letter or a passage, the better we will understand what is actually being written. So, finding the structure, how the passage was written, that's our second tool. Purpose and structure, those are the 2 tools we're going to use to unpack this letter. Now, in this first session, we want to see what the purpose and the structure is of the whole letter, because once we have that, it'll help us a great deal when we look at each part of the letter in future sessions. So let's start with some obvious but very important things that we can learn from just reading through Titus. And I actually strongly recommend that you do that right now. Stop the video and read through the whole of Titus. It'll only take you about 5 minutes. Now, just reading through Titus tells us, firstly, who wrote the letter. So we know that it was written by Paul, and he describes himself as an apostle of Jesus Christ in chapter 1, verse 1. We also know who he wrote it to. He wrote it to a man called Titus, who he describes as a true child in a common faith. Now, if we do a bit of background reading in some of Paul's other letters, such as 2 Corinthians, Galatians, 2 Timothy, we find out that even though Titus was not an apostle himself, he was certainly a close companion of Paul's and a co-worker with Paul. In fact, Paul relied quite heavily on him in his ministry as an apostle. And that takes us to Titus chapter 1 verse 5, where Paul tells us actually why he wrote this letter to Titus. He reminds him that he had left Titus in Crete, and he had left him there so that he would appoint elders in every town. Now, Crete is a small island in the Mediterranean Sea off the coast of Greece, and even though we don't know the details, it seems as though Paul and Titus had traveled to Crete. Paul had preached the gospel there, and a number of small churches had been planted as a result of that. And Paul has now moved on, and he's left Titus behind, and Titus must, as Paul puts it, he must bring order to these churches, and he must do that by appointing elders. And so Paul's just reminding him to do exactly that. But even though the whole letter is addressed directly to Titus, it was never meant only for Titus. We know that because in the very last sentence of the letter, in chapter 3, verse 15, Paul signs off his letter by writing, "Grace be with you all." And so clearly Paul understood that either Titus or someone else would actually read this letter to the churches. And so you have a situation where the churches in Crete listened in to this conversation that Paul is having with Titus about what he must do, the job that he has to do. Now, the reason that Titus must appoint elders in these new churches was not just because churches need elders. As you read on in chapter 1, verse 10 to 16, we soon find out that there are already false teachers who are starting to disrupt these churches, cause problems. And so not only do these churches need elders, but they need the right kind of elders. And you see, what is at stake here is not just the safety of these new churches, but actually what is at stake in the letter to Titus is, well, it's God's mission, his mission to Crete. In chapter 1, verse 12, we see that Crete is a pretty rough place, a godless place. It's full of liars and evil beasts and lazy gluttons. It's a place that has turned its back on God. And so the real question that is driving this letter is, well, how is God going to continue reaching the people of Crete now that he has started through Paul? And the answer that we get from this letter ultimately is that he's going to do it through these new churches that have been established. As Paul puts it in chapter 2, verse 10, he says these new Christians must be taught well so that in every way they may adorn the doctrine of God our Savior, so that they would draw people to the truth of the gospel. And so if the churches are going to be useful to God in his mission to Crete, they need the right kind of leaders who are the opposite to these false teachers, and leaders who will both believe and live the true gospel and will teach Christians in the churches to do the same. And so I think if there's one key passage that sums up the main purpose and message of Titus, then it's probably chapter 2, verse 11 to 14, where Paul writes, he says, For the grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation for all people, training us. This grace trains us to renounce ungodliness and worldly passions, and to live self-controlled, upright, and godly lives in the present age, an age where people need saving, as we wait for our blessed hope, the appearing of the glory of our great God and Savior Jesus Christ, who gave himself for us to redeem us from all lawlessness, and to purify for himself a people for his own possession who are zealous for good works. Good works that'll have an impact on our world. So why did Paul write the letter to Titus? Well, the ultimate purpose of this letter was that the churches in Crete would actually grow through good leadership, would grow in God's grace, so that God can use them to save more people in Crete. And as we begin to understand the purpose of this letter, it's not too difficult to see how relevant this letter is to us today, as God continues to work through us in our local churches. So that's the structure of the letter, the purpose of the letter. What can we see about the structure of the letter? How did Paul write this? How did he put it together? How is it organized? And I think the letter can be broken up into the following parts, and in the next 6 sessions we're going to unpack each of these parts bit by bit. So firstly there's the greeting in verses 1 to 4, and then straight away Paul goes into the main instruction where Titus is to appoint the right kind of elders in the churches in Crete. And he describes what these elders must be like. And then in chapter 1, verse 10 to 16, he explains why these elders are needed. And it's because of these false teachers that are already starting to cause disruption. And it's also because the kind of place that Crete is. It's a godless place. And then in chapter 2, in fact from chapter 2 onwards, Paul goes into a long section where he basically describes how these elders must be different to the false teachers in what they teach about how Christians must live and how Christians must behave. And then as he does that, he also he stops and he gives a powerful reason, a powerful motivation why they must teach these things. And so in chapter 2, verse 1 to 10, you have the first section where he explains how these elders must be different to the false teachers in what they teach. And then in chapter 2, verse 11 to 15, you have the first powerful motivation, the first powerful reason why they must teach these things. And then again, chapter 3, verse 1, he continues and he explains more ways that these elders must be different in what they teach. And then again, he gives this powerful motive as to why they must teach these things. So there we have both an idea of the purpose of this letter, and some idea of the structure of the letter. And so we're ready now to look at it from the beginning. So join me in the next session as we look at Paul's greeting in verses 1 to 4.